We'll have more people joining probably as we go on. But I'm Julie Enslow, and welcome to our 350 monthly meeting. This has been quite a month. There's been all these superstorms and hurricanes and floods and terrible fires in the West. And as George Stone was just saying, the smoke from those fires has impacted on people, not only coming across the northern part of the country, but do you remember in New York City a few weeks back, the air was worse in New York than it's ever been, ever, because of the fires in California. And it was just thick fog in New York City. So this is the whole climate change the impact is really gearing up to be a serious situation. Just a couple of days ago, there were over 200 lightning strikes in California. Thank God it wasn't dry lightning, or the entire state would be on fire right now, because it came up from Mexico all the way up throughout the whole state. But rain came with it, thank God, and put out a lot of these lightning strikes. But 4 of them hit near my daughter's place up in the Sierra Nevadas. But the rain was able to contain them. So it's been a very eventful summer as far as climate goes. So the announcements I really wanted to kind of get in on is what's being done about some of this. In Washington, D.C., there are meetings now with the House Ways and Means Committee and some other committees on the content of the Build Back Better bill, and they're renegotiating it on both sides. So it's called a reconciliation bill at this point. And the House Democrats are currently planning to keep most of the fossil fuel subsidies in the Build Back Better bill. And these are basically just free handouts for the oil, gas, and coal companies. And these kinds of handouts have stalled real climate progress for far too long, and it just can't continue. So I made a couple of phone calls today, and we can send out the information, can't we, Greg, about where people could call. But basically, Gwen Moore, being the congresswoman for a lot of us, is on the Ways and Means Committee. So she should get a phone call to tell her to make sure that they remove any fossil fuel subsidies from that bill, from the Build Back Better bill. And Chuck Schumer, who is leader of the Senate, is going to be instrumental in looking at the final version of that bill. So he could use a call. And the House Ways and Means Committee itself has an office, and somebody answers. And I talked to that person today. It's a real human being, and you can give them an earful. So that's one thing we can do. On this Friday, our weekly Stand for a Livable Planet with Fridays for the Future is going to take part in a national action to deliver copies of petitions to financial institutions to stop funding fossil fuels. And they want to have these petitions go in and have some real impact on banks and insurance companies and other lending agencies before the big Glasgow COP26 meeting in Glasgow, Scotland, which starts October 31st. They want some real commitments from these financial institutions to stop funding fossil fuels. And we'll be in front of Chase Bank on Water in Wisconsin again, as we are every Friday here in Milwaukee, and right across the street is Wells Fargo. Those are 2 of the biggest funders of fossil fuels in the world. And we are out there in their face every week. So this time we're going to be delivering this petition that's been gathering, I think, is it 15,000 names or something like that. It's a big one, and a cover letter. to the managers of these banks and any of the other bank branches. Greg Walter will have copies of this cover letter and petition. So if you come and join us, you can take a copy and drop it off at your local branch of Chase or Wells Fargo. And they're all over the city, of course, but just go in and ask to see the manager and drop off these letters and petitions. And then coming up this next September 24th, in a couple of weeks, is the global climate strike that's been called by Greta Thunberg. And we've been having a lot of difficulty getting connected with the schools because of them coming back under such restrictions with the COVID pandemic. And a lot of the schools aren't going to allow kids to take any field trips at all for safety reasons. And there aren't any buses available to even transport kids on field trips for them to come and join us at a big central event for the global climate strike, because there's a very big shortage of school bus drivers. And that's been a big issue here at MPS. So we're just want to gather people who we can that can leave work, leave home, whatever, and join us on Friday noon on September 24th on water in Wisconsin. And we'll concentrate again on Chase and Wells Fargo banks. And we'll have extra signs and banners, and then walk from water in Wisconsin a couple of blocks south to this little park right across from the public market. And there we will gather and, have a little rally. And there's a lot of traffic along there and a lot of pedestrian traffic too. So that will be our commitment to the global climate strike. And hopefully these events will build up to have more impact for the Glasgow COP26 UN climate change conference that starts October 31st and goes on to November 12th. The only other item is the status of line 3. One good thing happened just a few days ago. The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination is investigating the violation of the Anishinaabe treaty rights for line 3, and the impact of that could also impact on line 5 across the upper Michigan and the Straits of Mackinac. So it's a little sign of hope that there's another level of international interest now in line 3. Also, a number of progressive Democrats led by Ilhan Omar visited line 3 in the last few days. And so they'll be outspoken on this, I'm sure. And that's about it as far as updates on what we've been involved in. Also, our member Jill Ferguson was, and a few other people were up at line 3 again for actually in St. Paul for a big rally about line 3, where there were about 1,000 people that gathered at the Minnesota State Capitol building. And that was a big event. So Enbridge has had over 800 spills on its oil lines in the last 15 years, over 800. So it's not a matter of if these pipelines will leak, it's a matter of when. And this line 3 is going to be going over 200 bodies of water, including back and forth across the Mississippi River twice. So this is a serious issue, and we hope that it can be stopped. So now I'd like to introduce Linda Frank, who had contacted some of the faculty at UWM to find a speaker for this evening's meeting, because UWM has been doing work on the climate issue and its connection with weather factors and a number of other things. And she came up with a really interesting angle on this. So Linda, would you please introduce our speaker for the evening?
Thanks, Julie. Hi, everybody. Good to see everybody who can make it tonight. And yes, I did reach out to UWM as we were thinking about the connection between weather and climate. And I know that I have that question in my mind a lot of the times when we're having a pretty warm September, like we happen to be having right now. Those rather extreme storms that we had recently, I have heard that there was more tree damage than has really been encountered by the municipal forestry departments in the past. And so it makes you wonder, what is the connection between what's happening right now and climate? We know there's a difference between weather and climate. Weather is short-term events and the climate is longer term, but they're certainly related. And when I hear a weather report, I kind of want to hear that connection made if possible. And so, maybe that's something that will come to mind during the question and answer period after the presentation tonight. But well, we learned something very interesting in reaching out to UWM, and that is the climate consensus. And so let me introduce our speaker. Clark Evans is a UWM professor of atmospheric sciences, and he teaches UWM students how to get comfortable talking to school kids and local community groups about climate change. And as I understand it, Professor Evans signed up UWM with a new groundbreaking network of universities aiming to provide the public with reliable, actionable climate science information while empowering students to be the next generation of climate scientists and communicators. Which is a bit of a challenge because in many circles, climate change is still seen as a controversial topic, So I'm really impressed that UWM is taking this step, and I look forward to hearing more about that program. Please welcome Professor Clark Evans.
Thank you, Linda, for the introduction, and thank you everybody for having us here this evening. I'd hoped to have been joined by one of our PhD students, Andrew Westgate, but unfortunately he had to attend to a funeral of a close family friend in the Northeast earlier today. So I hope to be able to do this justice. I will start by saying that it's an exciting time to be involved with climate-related things at UW-Milwaukee. This fall, we've just launched our brand new Freshwater Sciences undergraduate major. It had been an exclusively graduate-only program to this point, but with the start of the new undergraduate major and UWM being the home of the UW Systems Freshwater Collaborative, in addition to the Atmospheric Sciences program that I'm a part of, the Conservation and Environmental Sciences program that has been very successful for a number of years, as well as our Geosciences and Geography programs in our College of Letters and Science, we have a lot of different things related to climate going on across the university. And this new initiative through the climate consensus, we hope will be able to unify a lot of that and both engage the public directly, but also let the public know that if you are interested in learning more about climate and want to take action, UWM is a place that you can look to and should look to be able to help with that. So this is part of a broader initiative called the Climate Consensus that was ultimately started about 7 or 8 years ago at Northern Vermont University in Linden, Vermont, formerly known as Linden State College. The person who started it, Dr. Janelle Hanrahan, is the head of their atmospheric sciences program, and it's one of the largest in the entire country. Vermont's a very small state, yet the atmospheric sciences program there at Northern Vermont University happens to be one of the largest in the entire country. Janelle received her PhD in atmospheric sciences from UW Milwaukee right as I started about a decade ago. And so that provides part of the connection as to how UWM became involved with the climate consensus. Andrew Westgate received his undergraduate degree from Northern Vermont University before coming to UWM for his master's and PhD. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the connections between us and Northern Vermont University, as well as the other universities that are a part of the climate consensus as we go forward in our presentation. So I don't think I have to really emphasize in our group here tonight that we know that climate change is happening. We see it in the data that come out year after year, decade after decade. The climate is warming and we are responsible for that occurring. And we're seeing its footprints in the weather events that were discussed earlier today. We're seeing its footprints on much longer timescales. I see it here in Grafton where I live. The Milwaukee River is literally right outside my window here. And all of my neighbors had their basements flooded multiple times over because of excessive rains in the past several years. But I'm not just the one who sees it. You all aren't just the ones who see it. Our students, our younger individuals see it as well. They see this data and they're in the process of learning what these data actually mean. We'd be naive to think that they don't see this and they don't understand some of the implications. But they also see the projections, not just what has happened, but what is projected into the future. And so we have the most recent data from the 6th IPCC that came out just about a month or so ago, looking at what has happened through to the present, and then several different projections based off of these shared socioeconomic pathways, with the trailing numbers between 1.9 and 8.5, ranging from the different amounts of radiative forcing into the atmosphere. And so as we move forward into the future, students see this happening and they have a lot of investment in that particular outcome. Right now, as they're in college, they're around this point where they've seen about a 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius warming globally since the 1850 to 1900 baseline. But as we get out another 20 years or so, that's going to only be higher, but there is some way of being able to control for that. The range is quite wide, from about 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. And then as we get out to the point where they're retiring, where their children are mid-career and their children's children are just starting their studies, there's quite a wide range depending on the actions that we take beginning now, whether we see a warming that's constrained within 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, or whether it grows much higher into the 3 to 4 degrees Celsius range. So they know what is happening, and they know that we have the potential to influence what will happen into the future. And so really the motivation behind the climate consensus is based off of just that. Students are knowledgeable about climate change, and they're motivated to avoid disastrous outcomes for their communities. Here at UW-Milwaukee, at the undergraduate level, that's primarily Southeast Wisconsin. If you draw a line from Green Bay down to Madison, down to Janesville, and go east from there to the lake, that's our populace. So our students here are motivated to make a difference right here in Southeast Wisconsin. At the graduate level, we're drawing from all over the country. The ones that I'm working with right now come from Ohio, from Georgia, from Minnesota, from Massachusetts, and from Michigan. So they come from all over the country to study here at UW-Milwaukee, and they're motivated and interested in going back into their respective communities as well to make a difference for climate, for weather, and for society as a whole. But in the backdrop of what is happening and what has happened, there's a broad general understanding through this Yale climate survey that came out last year that among adults in the United States, there's a plurality that believe that climate change or global warming more generally is happening. They may disagree on who's responsible for it, or if there even is a who that is responsible for it. But 72% of adults recognize that global warming is occurring. The challenge beyond there is that what they think about what we as scientists think. Surprisingly, only 55% of adults think that scientists agree that global warming is happening. And if you look at this map, if you look at where the yellows are located and where the blues are located, there's a really strong correspondence between the yellows and the 2020 presidential election where it went Democratic, and the blues and where the 2020 presidential election went Republican, which suggests to me at least that this has become a very highly politically charged, highly and unnecessarily politically issue. And so there's this question of, all right, if they believe that it's happening, but they don't think that scientists agree on it, maybe it's not that big a deal. Maybe we don't need to take action. Or maybe the cost of taking action is just too high relative to what the scientists think, or what I think that the scientists think is actually happening. And so this underscores the need for being able to communicate with people in broad senses, but especially community by community, one-on-one, in small groups, to be able to convey what scientists actually believe. Because over 97% of atmospheric scientists agree that global warming is happening and that humans are the cause. So we want to try to eliminate this gap between what the public thinks we think and what we actually think. Of course, there's no shortage of places that people can get climate-related information. Wide range of sources, some of which are very, very good, others of which are very, very bad. And non-experts don't necessarily know which ones are very, very good and which ones are very, very bad. Or more specifically, they choose to believe ones that are very, very bad because they find an identity in the broader messaging that those groups ultimately provide. And so when we're training students, we're helping them identify how to determine what is a good source from a bad source. So for instance, Climate Central is a very good source. They have a large reservoir of climate information targeted to things that people care about. Milwaukee Brewers are one thing that people in Wisconsin care about, especially this year with as good as the Brewers have played thus far and the potential for them to have a long playoff run coming up this fall. And they had put out this graphic earlier this year showing temperatures in southeast Wisconsin during the baseball season from April through September between 1970 and 2020 that show that they've increased by 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit on average in that time period. Some Brewers fans may love that because it means the roof is open more frequently during baseball season. But even as that creature comfort may be enjoyed, it's coming amidst a much more severe backdrop of the overall climate system changing. It leaves the Brewers, it leaves all of southeast Wisconsin more susceptible to disastrous high impact weather events that we've seen in recent years. Of course, there's very, very bad resources, such as the Heartland Institute. This infamous book was caused quite a stir within the university community when it started to be disseminated 3 or 5 years ago, posing this falsehood about scientists disagreeing about global warming. And yet this actually provides a really good teaching tool for our students because it allows us to help them see things like calls to expertise and where that expertise is not particularly warranted. You have a lot of people without atmospheric science backgrounds, but with doctorates suddenly speaking up about climate change because they have a particular motivation or an agenda to do so. So we can use resources like this to train students to be on the lookout for things that may seem too good to ultimately be true. And it also helps us to illustrate for them the lies that you can tell with data and with statistics, incorrect axes and chopping off of years rather arbitrarily. But for the general public, they don't have the benefit of that engagement with us, or at least haven't had that benefit of that engagement with us over time. And so we're wanting to be able to train students to be able to go into their communities, to their families, to their friends, to their community groups, and be able to say, all right, this is what you may be seeing, but here's what it actually means. And those trusted sources we found are really great references at being able to change minds, change hearts. Yet one of the challenges is that traditionally science-based curricula in college, undergraduate, graduate school, are all based on communicating to other scientists. This little cartoon here talks about how is the anthropogenic climate change impacting the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation and what impact will this have on regional precipitation patterns, which is all very important and very interesting to a scientist. But in terms of the general public, they may see a title like that or listen to me say a title like that and think, what does that mean? They need it distilled down, the broad public at least, need it distilled down more to, is this actually a thing? Is this happening? And right now they may think that it's happening, but they really don't know that much about it. And so into this void, we need to be able to step. So emphasizing again, physical scientists are really trained to talk to each other, and not really to the general public. And in fact, historically, most scientists have chosen to shy away from stepping to the public or speaking to the public. It's only been within the past several years with people like Katherine Hayhoe and her popular Global Weirding series, or the New Science Moms group, where you've seen distinct larger groups of scientists coming from one angle or another, speaking out to the public. And we want to be able to further that as we go forward. So what the climate consensus does is empowering students to engage in constructive climate change outreach in their communities, whether that be Southeast Wisconsin or all across the United States, to help close that consensus gap on human-caused climate change. We know the climate is changing. We know that we're responsible for it. The public isn't so sure, but we need to have the public become sure so that they can see the need for taking immediate action to be able to achieve a better outcome for the future. And so that's what we are hoping to do through the climate consensus. So a little bit of background on the climate consensus. As I mentioned, it started about 7 or 8 years ago at Northern Vermont University, a very small liberal arts college tucked away in Northern Vermont, yet home of one of the largest atmospheric sciences programs in the entire country. There were a couple of undergraduate students there who were really interested in climate, and they went to their professor, Dr. Janelle Hanrahan, and said, "We're interested in doing something about climate. Can you help?" And she said yes. She was just about to become a mother herself. She's very invested in climate-related issues, very motivated to be able to make a difference in her community there, as well as more broadly the Northeast and across the United States. So the climate consensus has been running for 7 or 8 years in Vermont, but within the past year, we've begun the work of extending this out into a multi-university nationwide network. And at this point, there are 8 universities, as well as a museum affiliated with McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, that are a part of the Climate Consensus Initiative. Starting in Northern Vermont University, we move into SUNY Environmental School there in central New York. We have UWM here in Milwaukee, Purdue just a few hours down the road in East Lafayette. We have George Mason outside of DC, Columbia, New York University, and the University of New Hampshire. So right now, Northeast and Great Lakes centric, but we hope, especially as we build out the infrastructure over the course of this next year, to be able to expand outward from there. And I think that we're in agreement that we want to target the South for being able to expand out, because that's where we think we could have the greatest positive impact. We don't always want to be talking to people who are naturally inclined to believe us or to see it the same way that we do, but we want to work to have those constructive conversations with people who may not see it the way that we do initially, but may be able to come to see it as we do over the course of time. So this year, just within the past month or so, the Climate Consensus is formally organized as a 501c3 charitable organization based in Vermont. Janelle is the president of the board, and we have a total of 7 board members, the most notable of which is Jagadish Shukla, a famous climate scientist at George Mason University. So over the years that the Climate Consensus has been in existence at Northern Vermont University, they've engaged in a wide range of activities. And these are pretty representative of the types of activities that we expect to undertake here at UWM, as well as at the other partner universities. And I would say that UWM is probably the furthest along, apart from Northern Vermont University, at getting these started. The bread and butter, so to speak, of the Climate Consensus has been school visits. And these are nice from 2 perspectives. One, they reach a lot of people at a relatively young age when they're still forming their ideas about science, how they see the world, what is important to them. And 2, they're relatively safe environments for students to be able to speak to and speak in. We want to be able to train students and build them up to be able to speak in any type of setting, any type of environment, but to do so often requires starting someplace safe, someplace easier to be able to converse with people and build up your confidence, build up your expertise before you feel comfortable going to speak, say, to a church group or to a manufacturing group or whatever the case may be. So these school visits are organized based in large part on schools that are interested in climate, but also schools that we have pre-existing connections with. At UWM, we're fortunate to have as one of our colleagues, Bart Adrian, the former Fox 6 meteorologist, who has a ton of connections with a lot of the parochial schools in the Milwaukee area. And some of the students who are involved with the climate consensus at this point are really interested in going to these parochial schools, to these church settings, to be able to speak about climate change and the need for taking action to preserve the creation, so to speak. But we also envision ourselves going to public schools as well. And I think that's been the primary focus of a lot of the activities in Vermont so far. Beyond just the school visits, we've also had the, a little surprise my, there we go. We've also had a number of community events. Here in this case, it's an example from an Acting on Climate Change in Vermont series. And they've had a large range of community groups, from golf course superintendents to groups involved with the politics of Vermont and everywhere in between. Groups that are interested in learning a little bit more about climate because they see that climate and weather have some sort of impact on their operations, and they want to be as prepared as they can be to adapt and mitigate those impacts moving forward. And so these types of events are often very curated for the students. We want to give them an authentic experience, but we want to, again, give them a safe experience so that they're not just shouted down, talked down to by people who might have malintentions within the audience. There have also been a number of students who have been interested in activism. It's not something that everybody has been interested in, and nor do we expect everybody to be interested in it. But there are quite a few who see the value of going in and participating in things like the People's Climate March. They've also engaged in a lot of activities to support climate activism. They participated in a half marathon together in New York State several years ago. And I could envision UWM's climate consensus group doing something like the River Edge Nature Center in Newburgh, their annual bike ride in June to support their conservation activities up on the Ozaukee-Washington County border moving forward. And then finally, the climate consensus is also always seeking to share its organizational knowledge with others in the university and more broad academic communities. So they're constantly presenting at professional meetings of the American Meteorological Society, the American Geophysical Union, and smaller ones that take place across the country to share what we've learned, as well as to learn what they've learned, because we've recognized we're not the only people doing this. There are lots of groups at individual colleges and universities, and across a wide range of demographics in those universities, from community colleges and minority serving institutions up to the elite of the elite in the Ivy League. And so we want to learn from them, as well as translate whatever knowledge we can translate back toward them. And we'll be presenting on the climate consensus activities at the upcoming annual meetings of the American Geophysical Union and the American Meteorological Society later on this fall and into the winter. The activities that the climate consensus has been involved in Vermont have drawn a lot of local press. And Vermont being relatively small, it's perhaps easier than here in Southeast Wisconsin to draw that type of press activity. I can't imagine that the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel necessarily will be beating down our door immediately to learn a little bit more about what the climate consensus is doing. But there are tons of other media like WUWM, Wisconsin Public Radio, and you all may be familiar with some of the climate change reports that ran last year, sponsored by one of my colleagues, Professor Paul Rober, and supported by the BRICO Fund, connecting high impact weather events in a climate context. Things like that, or a lot of the local twice weekly or weekly papers across the suburban and exurban counties across Southeast Wisconsin and beyond. We hope to be able to see our activities be picked up by the press there moving forward. So these activities are all nice and good, but it's important to measure their effectiveness in two ways. Their effectiveness at training the students for the role that we're desiring to train them for, but also to see their effectiveness within the community. And while that latter part is much harder and takes a prolonged period of time to be able to accurately measure, being able to gauge the students is a lot more straightforward and something that has been done. And so posing this question to them in 2018 at Northern Vermont University, how often do you discuss global warming with family and friends? Initially, it was relatively low. Only about 22% of them said that they occasionally or often did. Over half said rarely, and almost 20% said never. And these are sophomore and higher undergraduate students, 36 in total, before they participated in the climate consensus activities. But after doing so, those same students, it's completely flipped. Almost 80% of them say that they often or occasionally talk about global warming and climate change with their family and friends. They've clearly become more comfortable at talking about these occasionally thorny issues. We can perhaps disagree whether they should be thorny issues, but the fact of the matter is that they have been very thorny, especially for a lot of the students there. Yes, Vermont is in the Northeast. There's a lot different political climate there, but a lot of them come from rural parts of Maine and New Hampshire, Vermont, upstate New York, where it's not quite the same as on the I-95 corridor or in some of the more urban areas away from there. And so being able to see that they've become much more comfortable with talking about global warming and climate change with their family and friends is really encouraging to see, and something that we expect we'll be able to mimic here at UW-Milwaukee. And we have a lot of potential. I mentioned a lot of our students are from Southeast Wisconsin. We have some from Milwaukee itself. We have a lot from the suburban regions, Kenosha, Racine, Sheboygan, Waukesha, Brookfield. And there are a lot of communities that these students will be going back into. They can go back to their high schools. They can go to their community groups, their families and their friends. And we hope that we'll be able to see similar success with our efforts as we really get them started here in the next month or so. So the climate consensus is active on various forms of social media, generally some form of the climate consensus name, whether that be on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We also have the website, theclimateconsensus.com, that tells a little bit more about what the climate consensus is and has a number of examples of what the climate consensus has done, ranging from student prepared videos to student developed news articles and everything in between. My email, as well as Andrew's and Janelle's emails, are there at the bottom of this slide as well. We'd love to hear more about things that you all are involved in, ways that we could perhaps partner with you all, or perhaps things that we may not be aware of that would be great opportunities for us to be involved with. So that's what I have for my presentation. I'm happy to open this up for discussion. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen here so we can go back to video. But yes, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts, interested in learning from you all. What ideas spring to your mind? How might we be able to partner with you or you partner with us? And ultimately change things for the better with regards to climate in Southeast Wisconsin and beyond. And I see Tim mentions in the chat, can we see your email addresses again? I'll put those into the chat window so that everybody has them here. So mine's coming up first, and then Andrew's, and then Janelle.
And I'll say that likewise, so hopefully within a week, we'll have that on the 350 site along with this video, so of tonight's
Wonderful.
meeting. So, yeah,
and the Climate Consensus webpage does include video recordings of a lot of the presentations that others have given about the climate consensus. And we certainly would love to be able to share the recording from this video with the broader community as well. If nothing else, we view it as a great opportunity for our other university partners to be able to draw motivation from what we've been able to present to you all, as well as to other groups. So
great.
Clark, congratulations for an excellent presentation, and especially for the whole concept and reality of the climate consensus. This is exactly what's needed to spread the word and gain greater support. UWM actually was involved in this sort of thing starting about 20 years ago when Mike Lovell was the chancellor briefly. Milwaukee Area Technical College sponsored an annual event called the Wisconsin Sustainability Summit. UWM participated in that. We brought in a lot of great speakers. I noticed Columbia is on your list, Climate Consensus. Of course, that's the home of the godfather of climate scientist, Jim Hansen. And we brought Jim Hansen in twice to the Sustainability Summit to speak on the subject. Also brought in Michael Mann from Penn State 3 times. And UWM participated in those, and we did a lot of work in trying to educate people about climate change back starting in the late 90s and up through the 20s. I need to make an important announcement at this point. I am retired now from teaching. I taught at the Milwaukee Area Technical College for many years. Now I'm on the board, as is Tom Seary, one of our steering committee members. I'm on the board of the United Nations Association of Greater Milwaukee. And as part of our celebration of the 76th anniversary of the United Nations next month, we're bringing in Michael Mann as our keynote speaker. And Annette Robertson is arranged for him to go to Whitefish Bay High School to speak to, but that's not open to the public. The next day, that'll be Friday, October 22nd. October 22nd. The next day, Saturday, October 23rd, the United Nations Association of Greater Milwaukee, which meets down at the Lutheran Church on 19th in Wisconsin, is going to have Michael Mann as the keynote for its monthly program. Now, this will be a hybrid presentation, and everybody will be able to access it if they have the link to the Zoom site. So that's next month, a little more than a month from now. So I'm just making that announcement now. So those of you who are interested, you can come to see Michael Mann in person on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock at the church down on 19th in Wisconsin, or you can tune in by Zoom at that same time.
Linda Frank, please.
Yes, thank you again for that really interesting presentation and for what you are doing at UWM. And I appreciate the comments from George Stone about some history on this as well. You know, all of the major environmental groups and the Milwaukee Climate Task Force are making serious efforts along equity concerns, equity and inclusion. And so I would ask the question of whether your climate consensus work has considered that yet. You know, have you been able to go to schools with large populations of students of color, and have you ever given any thought to equity and inclusion and addressing the impacts of climate change disproportionately affecting people of color?
Yes, and that's a great point and great question there, Linda. We've given thought to it. We're still in the process of developing our roster of activities for the 2021-2022 academic year, but it's on the foremost of our minds. Myself as the faculty advisor, as well as Andrew as the student president, and then his other student officers, that we want to be able to engage with some of the underrepresented, underserved, and socioeconomically disadvantaged groups. And being here in Milwaukee, we have a lot of them surrounding the university, surrounding the downtown area, but we view that as opportunity. We have partners with the National Weather Service, as well as Wisconsin Sea Grant, who have done work engaging those communities on how they receive weather hazard information, how they handle severe cold during the winter time. And we hope to be able to leverage some of those connections as we move forward. Since they have those relationships already developed, we wouldn't necessarily be coming into them as these people from the outside dictating, all right, here's the truth about climate, but rather leverage the credibility of our partners to say, all right, these are people you can trust, and here's what they want to work with you on doing with regards to climate resilience, climate understanding, and just how can we help you in the situations that you're in? So we're very much interested in doing that, and we'll be working to develop that out over the course of the next 2 to 3 months.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Clark. Tim Schwartz.
Okay, hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so my name's Tim. I think this is my first time in the 350 Milwaukee group. Boy, I'm trying to figure out how to condense this. There's so much I want to say, but just to try to condense it a little bit here. I guess the first thing I'll say is that myself and a group of activists and business people here in the city from a group called the Milwaukee Cooperative, or Cooperation Milwaukee, excuse me, are in the process of the early stages of organizing a local community assembly, specifically around the climate issue, to try to bring the community together to talk about the climate issues, to talk about the IPCC report, the 6th one that came out, as Chris was talking about earlier. We did have the idea of trying to reach out, and I'm really glad that Chris was on the call tonight, because we did intend to reach out to some of the climate scientists at UWM to see if we can get somebody to come in and speak to us and kind of answer questions about the report and kind of the current state of the climate and that kind of thing in an accessible way that people can understand. But I wanted to make all of you aware that we're organizing this, because we really want to try to include some of you and people in other environmental groups in the area in this assembly. We would like to invite you to come and share with people what your group are doing and what actions people can take if they want to get involved through 350 or the Sierra Club or whatever other groups in the city might be interested in participating.
Yeah, Charlie's next.
Okay. Yeah, Clark, how do you speak to your students truthfully about this dire state of the environment and the nature of the crisis without overwhelming them and triggering a kind of a sense of hopelessness and depression? And I'm wondering if some of your students are expressing a sense of betrayal by the present generation in terms of leaving them a pretty bad mess to deal with in their lifetimes.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question there, Charlie. To the latter point, I would say I personally haven't heard a lot of it yet, but I know that that sentiment exists. And so whether it's they don't feel comfortable sharing it quite yet, or they just want to share it in other ways, I'm not entirely sure. But I haven't directly heard it from our students quite as of yet. But it's challenging. I view it like dealing with interpersonal relationships that are perhaps going sour. It can be very easy to think when you see a series of negative things, one after the other, you get this kind of negative sentiment and it just overrides your thoughts on everything related to the topic. And it is a spiral downward. So I really try to re-engage with the students and say, all right, let's focus on one small thing that's right in front of us that we can think more positively about and see what we can do about that one little thing. We can't fix everything ourselves right now. We need to be able to partner with others to identify where each of our respective strengths are best leveraged. But let's identify the one small thing that is in front of us right now. Let's work together to try to achieve that. And then once we're done, let's identify the next small thing that is right in front of us, while keeping sight of the bigger picture as well. So I find that reorienting them on those wins, as we may call them, really helps to stem the tide of this gigantic size of the problem and the scope of the problem. It's not perfect, but that's the approach that I've personally used.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Clark. Jan, you're up next.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting and very important. But it seems to me that one way to reach a lot of people about how climate change is tying in with all these weather events we're having is through the weather reports we get on the news every night. Have your students at all reached out to any of the television stations to ask them to to draw this parallel between climate change and the issues they are reporting about?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jan. And the presentation that Dr. Hanrahan and Andrew gave to the Greater Milwaukee chapter of the American Meteorological Society a couple of months ago had multiple meteorologists from both Channel 12 and Channel 6 in the Milwaukee area in attendance. They see climate, they know that it's a problem. They want to, as well as Channel 58, I know one of their meteorologists, Sam Cuffle, was one of my first students at UW-Milwaukee, and I have a good working relationship with her. They all see this as a problem. They all want to be able to communicate about it. Those of you who may follow Mark Baden on social media will see him talk about it from time to time. Not frequently, but especially when the weather is a little bit more tame. The challenge is station management. They are reluctant to do something that they feel might alienate a segment of their audience. Even though the Milwaukee market has been one of the better ones across the nation in terms of maintaining viewership for local news, it's still slowly declining amidst the broader trends of declines in ratings across all of television. And unfortunately, climate change has been at the point where it is unnecessarily divisive and could cause a station to lose a segment of their viewership. And the station management, even if the meteorologists have been willing and wanting to speak up about it, management has not yet given the okay. I think we're starting to see that change, however, because I think that the perceptions in the state and more broadly are shifting to the point that you want to be first on this topic because it's something that you can then point to and say, we're leading the way with coverage about weather and climate. And so I think you're going to see some station. My prediction, I've always been told, don't make a prediction that you don't have to, but I will make this one prediction. I suspect within the next year or two, you'll see one of the major TV stations here in the Milwaukee area go forward with something climate specific. I don't know which one it will be, but one of them will. And once one of them breaks the ice, I suspect others will break the ice as well, especially if they see that there's not the pushback that they fear. There will always be a vocal minority that pushes back no matter what. But I think that they would find, and I hope that they would find, that it would just be that, a vocal minority. So even as you haven't seen it a lot yet, and I can understand how frustrating it might be to have not seen any of the stations really go and hammer this idea home like others have in other markets. I think we're going to see it soon.
Well, I hope you're right. Thank you.
I hope so too. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Dale. Greg.
Okay, Clark. First of all, very interesting and informative presentation. I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
At one point you talked a bit about your students going out into the community, into schools, and that they had mostly gone to parochial schools. And I guess that, well, let me know. I think that was because they had connections with those schools. But I'm curious about what the reception is, not so much by the students, but by the parents and the faculty at those schools in terms of pushback. And if the reason that they're mostly parochial and not public schools has something to do with pushback from the community also.
Sure. And I should clarify, it raises a good point that you mentioned there, Greg. A lot of the connections that we have with parochial schools are through Bart Adrian in our atmospheric sciences program, and he has been the one who has gone out to those to date, primarily talking about weather and more generally STEM rather than climate specific. So we haven't yet had much of an opportunity to go out into those particular schools or any schools here in the Milwaukee area quite yet to be able to speak about climate and climate related issues. It will be very interesting to see the reception that we get when we start to formally reach out to those, especially if once, hopefully, COVID issues start to wane, although I'm rather pessimistic about that in the short term. I think that we will see some resistance. I think that it may not come before or during the talk, but rather after the talk, as the parents and others in that community have the opportunity to digest what was shared. But I think that framing it it really underscores the importance of framing it in the right way for the right audience. That the conversation that we're having right now is nowhere near the same conversation I might have or the students might have with groups from parochial schools or churches more generally. The essence of the talk would be the same, but the way that it would be framed would be quite a bit different. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be working on with our students, and that the Vermont group has been working on with their students, is tailoring the message for the individual group and community to try to mitigate some of that. And then putting a lot of it on my shoulders, or whatever the faculty member or members who are involved with it. If there's pushback, that it comes toward us, that it doesn't come toward the students and further amplify that sense of frustration, the overwhelming sense of despair about not being able to do anything because there's so much pushback in addition to the enormity of the problem. And so we'll be working with our students on that. But I did want to clarify that we haven't yet been able to do that specifically from a climate perspective in the parochial schools.
Please let me add a point here regarding the parochial schools. 5 years ago, Pope Francis issued an encyclical, I think it was encyclical number 51, 100 pages or more, in which he detailed the case for global warming and climate change and urged people to get involved and address this problem. So I think that may be a reason the parochial schools are more accepting.
Thank you, George. Tom Seary's up next.
Thank you. Let me end run briefly. I'm out on the street there, Waterton, Wisconsin, pretty regular. And one of the things that we have is these signs that say honk for a livable environment. And what I've done often enough is turn to the passerbys. And the women are always reactive. And we both go away from each other feeling good, and we're caring about the environment. I try to do this with the, if you will, the bigoted barons of big business, the suits, and it's a wall. And so my question, Clark, is this way. In your consensus process, are you dealing with brick walls? Or are you dealing with people who are, kind of flexible and maybe will listen? But how? Yeah, that's the question. How do we sell this to brick walls?
Right, and that's really the $1 million question, Tom, is how do we sell it to brick walls? The defeatist perspective would be that we never can, and so we should just work on the other 75, 80% of people and achieve overwhelming consensus. But of course, we're there on a lot of other topics, and yet the brick walls keep us from being able to make meaningful progress. And so I don't really perhaps subscribe to that defeatist viewpoint. To this point, admittedly, the climate consensus is focused more on those more persuadable groups rather than tackling the brick walls. I think that's probably where we're going to be for the UWM group as well, at least in the short term, as we develop that local expertise, the local connections within the community, and ultimately build up to identifying the brick walls that are biggest here in the community. I'm aware of some of them thinking from the context of the I-94 proposed expansion project west of downtown Milwaukee, as you're getting different groups line up on both sides of the picture, not from a fiscal perspective, not even from an equity perspective, but from a climate perspective as well. So just working over the next few years to identify who those are, and in that time frame, create our action plan to be able to try to address that. But admittedly, we are some time away from being in a place to meaningfully do that.
Okay, so we should keep working on the brick walls regardless.
I believe so. I don't want to view it as completely lost cause.
Okay.
Thank you, Tom. Julie Enslow.
Here we go. Thank you.
Yes.
Back in the 1980s, I was very involved in doing a lot of public speaking around the community on the issue of nuclear power. And there was a statewide coalition that defeated the building of about 5 different nuclear power plants in the state of Wisconsin at that point. And then I had a number of opportunities to speak to Lions clubs and Rotary clubs and those kinds of civic organizations who thought that it would be sort of, I think, amusing to have this young woman come in and speak to them about something as technical as nuclear power. Well, I learned my stuff. I knew what I was talking about, and I aimed at their pocketbooks. And the whole angle to get to these people, I still believe on this issue too, is their pocketbooks, and that climate change is going to just wipe out, first of all, the insurance companies are already freaking out about how are they going to pay the insurance costs for all of these floods and these wildfires. They won't even give fire insurance anymore to a lot of people in a lot of areas because it's, it's suicide for them. So this is going to make a big impact on big business financially. And I think that's one angle that we can use in talking to the suits. And then another thing I wanted to mention to you, Clark, is that there's the organization Rethinking Schools. Here it's located in Milwaukee. It's a national organization. It was founded here actually in Milwaukee. Bob Peterson is one of the founders, who's now head of the Milwaukee school board, or he's on the school board. And they put out some excellent publications. And they, a few years back, put out one about teaching about climate change. And it's a whole text, it's a teacher's guide really for a whole series of units on climate change that can be used directly in the classroom. It's very, very well done. It's a very good resource. And it's something that your students that you work with might like to look at as a reference and have it as something that they could hand to teachers that they encounter in their work too. So Rethinking Schools would have that in their stock to give to you, I'm sure.
Great, I appreciate that, Julia. If you wouldn't mind maybe sending me an email just to, so I have a record of that as well, I would really appreciate it. And to your earlier point about hitting them in their pocketbook, I agree. I think that that's going to have a lot of potential for affecting change. We see that to some extent with the coronavirus vaccine. Delta Airlines started to say you need to be vaccinated or we're going to charge you $200 more per month for your health insurance. And all of a sudden you got half of the people who are unvaccinated to get vaccinated because they didn't want to face that immediate financial loss. I think being able to emphasize the loss rather than the gain, as well as the immediacy rather than the ambiguous future, has a lot of potential to be able to affect change, even for the suits. Granted, I say that having grown up in Florida, I lived there during the 90s and 2000s. We faced a lot of hurricanes. We saw insurers flee from the coasts. We saw the state-run insurance come in and then spread the cost over the entire state rather than have it be targeted specifically to the coastlines. And so I'm not as optimistic about hitting them in the pocketbook, so to speak, as I would be if I hadn't have seen that necessarily. But I don't think that we should necessarily let what happened in one particular scenario keep us from being able to see the value of a similar approach more broadly as well.
Okay, thanks, Julie. Thanks, Clark. Jamie.
Let me make a point about global warming and climate change because they're being used interchangeably. This was originally called global warming because the Earth's energy balance is positive. The Earth is gaining more heat from the sun than it's radiating back into space. And that's primarily due to the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But the point is, it's global warming is what's causing the climate changes and all these impacts. There was a staffer in the House Republican caucus who suggested we don't use global warming anymore, we'll use climate change because global warming is kind of scary for people where climate change isn't. We know climate changes naturally because we had the ice ages. And so they were very successful and global warming has been almost universally abandoned, even though it's a more accurate description of the cause.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, George. Jeannie?
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to mention a couple of organizations that I've been involved with. Maybe you're familiar with them already. Just Faith, which has programs on social justice, and some of them are on the environment. I've taken a few of those courses, and they're really good. And they're used for people who have faith or don't, but you can use them in groups. And then the other organization that has been having some interesting speakers is the Catholic Climate Covenant. And I just wanted to mention that, and I didn't know if you had heard of them or not.
Oh, thank you for sharing, Jean. I hadn't heard of those specifically. I'm familiar with other resources from a church/Christian based perspective, but not those ones in specific. So thank you for sharing.
Okay. Thanks, Jeannie. Clark, Charlie Bensinger.
Yeah, Clark, have you or do you deal with the issue of global population and the impact of 10 billion people on Earth's resources? And how do we ever get to sustainability with an ever-growing population of that size?
At this point, Charlie, no, we haven't. We haven't focused on the population aspect. It will be interesting to see as we really start to build out the student group at UW-Milwaukee, whether we get students from the geography side of things, where they're more actively dealing with that challenge and the associated fallout from there. But from our atmospheric science dominant perspective to this point in time, I can't say that we have focused on it.
Okay.
Well, I think we should all thank Clark Evans for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much, Clark.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
I've
you.
appreciated the opportunity to speak with you all this evening, and thank you for sharing all of the resources, all of your great questions. I'm really motivated by your passion for the climate crisis that we face. So thank you very much for having us once again.
Bravo.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We have a few minutes. A couple of things that surfaced that we as climate activists could perhaps think about zeroing in on at some point. And one was targeting the TV station management. It sounds like this is a real weak link in getting climate change and global warming to be focused on by the meteorologists on TV, that we really need to go beyond them personally and to the station management to encourage them to that we want that in the programming. And so maybe if there's anybody interested, we could be thinking about doing some direct visits with station management or some demonstrations out in front of the TV stations, asking to focus on the connections between weather and climate change and global warming. And so that's one thought that came to my mind. Another thing is if we know personally teachers or say religion teachers in churches that might be appropriate for this, or whatever groups of younger people that we might have connections with to be recipients of these presentations that Clark students are giving, we should contact him and let him know about some possible opportunities for them to meet with these groups of students and talk to teachers of your own kids, or your be open to having this program come into their schools. And so it's very important that we spread this. Another thing is sort of an extension of what we're doing tonight, what we're talking about tonight, is our program for next month, where we have Dr. Philip Chard, who is a psychotherapist and a well-known award-winning columnist and book author. And Philip Chard writes a column every month called Out of My Mind for the Shepherd Express. Some of you may read that regularly. I always read his columns. He's very good on many issues, but he specializes in nature therapy and applied eco-psychology. And he is going to talk about how do we talk to our children and to our grandchildren about this issue, about climate change, without totally freaking them out and to getting them totally depressed and turned off about the future of their own lives. And So that's going to be the, the thrust about how we as individuals, as parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, can talk to the younger people in our lives about this with honesty and truthfulness, and yet some sense of hope. So I think this will be a terrific follow-up to tonight's presentation. And so I ask you all to join us next month, that's October 12th, on a Tuesday night again. And is there anything else that anyone?
Yes, Julie. Yes. George Stone would like to speak, and I want to add something to what you said. George?
Okay.
Well, Julie, I strongly support your idea of putting pressure on the local TV stations regarding the connection between weather and climate. I think the way to go after them is the same way that you're going after the funding for fossil fuels. Go after the sponsors. They're the ones, they live on their ratings, which determines what they can charge their sponsors. So let's go after the sponsors for these TV, and that'll get the message across. And I wanted to remind everybody, October 23rd, celebrating the 76th anniversary of the United Nations, Michael Mann will be in town, and his presentation will be available via Zoom from the United Nations Association of Greater Milwaukee.
Thank you, George. And it was also my follow-up to Julie's suggestion about local TV stations. I'll tell you, the ice is breaking at the national level. There's almost no network where I haven't heard them speak about climate and weather, and they're weather people. So I'm volunteering that we keep a track on this. And if you hear this on national networks, take a note of the network, the time, and the program. That's good fodder to go to their sister station locally and say, look what's happening nationally. And also CNN is leading the way in terms of this issue on regular programming. But I'll volunteer to take information from people and collect it so that we have that kind of short database on nationals. So forward it to me, please, when you see or hear that.
Thank you, George. Yeah, I think it's a real excellent project, really, for us to take on, is to focus on that. And then also, don't forget about Friday noons down at Water in Wisconsin, where we have an opportunity to speak directly to a lot of pedestrians that come by. Just last Friday, there were a couple of people said that they were going to take their accounts out of Chase Bank once they found out from us that Chase Bank was the biggest funder of fossil fuels. We get this, periodically people say, oh, I'm going to switch banks. And then there's people who say, well, tell me more about this. And they'll just want to talk about climate change. They'll thank us for being there. And lots of horns are honking as the traffic goes by with our signs, honk for a peaceful planet, honk for a living planet. And they're cheering us on, and it brings awareness to them right then about how critical this issue is. We have some signs that just say climate change is real, or it's code red for the earth. And so it's a weekly presentation from 12 to 1 that we're out there with our signs, and we would invite more people to join us. Thank you.
Charlie and George, we've got a couple short minutes. Charlie.
Linda, I'm wondering if you can update us quickly on the state of the climate change, the city climate change task force meetings.
Okay, well, thanks, Charlie. Some of the effort continues to go into following the proceedings on American Rescue Plan funding and how that's going to be allocated. There's not much that has been decided yet on that, so it's still a great time to contact Common Council members and ask that they support the $5 million for a residential energy efficiency program targeted to the high energy burden census tracts that has been proposed, workforce development that's been proposed. And we'd also like to see support for the nature in the city initiatives to support green infrastructure, tree planting, and removing excess pavement, and also transportation infrastructure that is environmentally friendly. So that's one main thing. And you've all heard about the video survey that is available for people to complete for their views on climate. And there are some new written survey opportunities that have gone up on the climate webpage. And so there are specific ones, about transportation, one about nature in the city, and one about jobs and equity, for instance. So that kind of public outreach is moving forward. And there also was a really excellent panel on jobs and equity and workforce development, green jobs. Very small audience, but a terrific panel and a really good discussion that happened there. And so I remember Dan Folkman took a video of that, and he will be ready to release it fairly soon. So everybody would be able to watch a recording of that.
Yeah.
Great.
I'd like to add on to that, please. I think significantly, and I don't know the detail, but our effort around net zero housing has received some grant funding. And that's built around building a factory to make units that are assembled into housing. And we're looking at a half a block on the 30th Street corridor to do all of that. I think that's significant. Outside of our work, as we move along and know that the things that have to be done, the Milwaukee Police Department has purchased their SUVs to be hybrids. The city county bus system has purchased 15 electric buses that would run the freeways economically. So things are happening, and there will be a report where we're enlisting the process for our next report. And I think we're looking at coming out at the beginning of next year. Is that correct, Linda?
Yes. There is a draft due by the end of the year. Correct.
Yeah.
And it looks like there's probably going to be a firm hired in 2022 to actually put it in final form.
Thank you. George Stone. Charlie, did we get you?
No, yeah, thanks. Yeah, Charlie didn't take his hand down.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make a couple of notes. I saw Michael Mann on MSNBC interviewed twice in the last couple of weeks. The first time he made an important point that it's great to turn the thermostat down a couple of degrees and to drive less and policy change. And in his more recent appearance with Jeff Bennett just a few days ago, he made the point, which Linda made earlier too, about social justice. He made the point that most of the people who suffer the most from climate change, from global warming impacts, are poor people and people of color around the world. So the social justice aspect of this is very important. And I gave the Pope a plug a little while ago for his encyclical. In the interest of religious balance, I want to just remind you that we've passed Rosh Hashanah. We're now in the Jewish New Year, the Shana Tova. And tomorrow, starting tomorrow, is the highest holy day in Judaism, Yom Kippur. So let's ask God's blessing on our efforts to address and mitigate climate change, global warming.
Well, I think that we need to close at this point. It's a few minutes after 8:30. And really appreciate how involved everyone is always with our discussions and comments and questions. This is not a shy group. We always have plenty of opinions and things to say and to add to the discussion. So thank you all for participating. And we will be sure to read the 350 newsletter emails that come out that Greg Walter puts together. They're really great. They have a lot of content and a lot of actions that you can take right there. A lot of petitions to sign and all kinds of things, but a lot of good information. So watch for those, read them, and be with us again next month for Philip Chard. Thank you so much. Good
Thank
night.
you, Clark.
Adios.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone. Have a good night.
Gracias, adios.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Good night.
George,
Thank
be
you.
careful on that horse.
Become such a mountain man.